Welcome into Dawson Now. As you know, the podcast dedicated to the cultural catalyst of our day, the men and women God raises up to be the discerners of information at the gates of a free society. Welcome in. I'm your host, Scott Dawson. It's a privilege to be with you each and every week. Now we're on podcast number something. I've stopped counting, and we're adding something new. We're starting the YouTube channel from the very beginning. Some of you have contacted me and said, hey, we only get the guest. We don't get your opening and closing segment. So welcome in. We're glad you're here. What a week to join us. As you know, the last episode, we had Coach Gene Chizik, and he predicted that SEC football would happen. I felt the roar from the crowd when we got the understanding that football hopefully will happen this next season. Welcome in, Mark Congleton, our executive producer.
You keep looking at me like I've got some input in this.
Yeah, I'm hoping and praying. It's just one of those things because I know if we can get college football up and running, that's going to help people gather back in crowds.
Yeah.
I was in the airport yesterday flying back, and two things I noticed. One, half the restaurants and half the stores are just closed.
Right.
It looked like I was in another country, which is very sad. The other thing I noticed that was quite alarming was, not that everyone has a mask on. That's, we have to have that right now based on law and just being wise. But no one's looking at you in the eyes anymore.
Huh.
That's what I noticed. I felt like I was watching a late-night, old-fashioned sci-fi movie where everyone was robots, and I found myself just starting conversations with strangers. Just, hey, look at me, because I'm afraid we're in a paradigm shift, right? And we don't recognize it.
Yeah, I think you may be right.
That people are now at a position where they're just not engaging. So to me, I go, timing is everything, and I'm so glad you've joined us for today's podcast. We're going to be speaking today. Our guest is a gentleman that has just recently written a book. He's got an evangelist heart. It's about passing the baton to this next generation with the gospel. And I feel like maybe it reminds me of the 1980 U.S. relay team, fastest group of men ever assembled. It was the relay, and I think it was between the second and third segment when they were passing the baton. It slipped through the guy's fingers, and they were disqualified. And here's the point. You can have the greatest assets at your fingertips. We've got great biblical literature. We've got podcasts. We've got lights and smoke and all that kind of stuff. But if you're not paying attention to the details, if you're not focused on passing that baton to this next generation behind us, we're just the ultimate goal is to finish. And I want to finish my race well. Right. And so we're going to be talking about that called the relay. And, I'll just go ahead and throw one more preacher segment in there. As you can tell, I'm starting now to preach live, and I've just got all this stuff built up.
You've been cooped up for so long.
Oh, my gosh. Sunday was phenomenal. Anyway, there's three types of Christians. There's the remember when Christian. That's the ones that, man, everything was better 20 years ago. We're always focused on 20 years ago. The good old days of Barney Fife and Mayberry. They ain't coming back, folks. So it's remember when. The overwhelming majority of today are the remember me. Hey, remember me. It's all about consumer Christianity. And then there's a segment of our church life that remembers why. And that is what we're going to be talking about today, of passing that baton, being intentional, of remembering why we are here. After you get Jesus, ladies and gentlemen, there's nothing else to get the rest of our lives about giving him away, being intentional about propagating the gospel. So we've got a great podcast that we're going to be bringing to you. Hold on. Our guest in just a few moments, the author of the new book, The Relay. We'll be right back. This is Scott Dawson. Welcome back into Dawson Now. I forget we're on the YouTube channel and I have no rhythm, so you just saw an abstract form of trying to dance. I was at least moving my head a little bit. So I remember the old episode of Everybody Loves Raymond, I think. Is just
that's right.
Don't let them see you dance. Anyway, all right. So glad to have you in joining us this week for our podcast episode of The Relay. Our guest in the studio, first time since March, someone has braved the elements to come into the studio. So I give you props on that. I know that there's no fear in evangelism, but let me give him a little bit of background, and then we're going to come right into the conversation. He is the equipping and teaching pastor at the Center for Executive Leadership. It's a ministry that's been around Birmingham for so many years that have equipped so many young business leaders and mentored so many in the business community. Their roots run deep in our city. His wife is Jill. He's got 4 children. He's an adjunct professor at the Birmingham Theological Seminary, and he is the author of the new released book, The Relay, and the subtitle is Passing Along Your Faith in the Race to Save Christianity from Extinction. I am a professional. Don't try that at home. Out of 80-plus episodes, that's one of the few faux pas, but just run with it. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome into the studio, author George Shamblin. George, welcome in. I'm glad you're here.
Appreciate it. Really appreciate it.
And you can help me try to pronounce that word later on, of a tough word, extinction. Anyway, so George, tell me a little bit about how did you get to your role now with the Executive Center for Leadership, and just let some people get to know who you are.
Sure. So I got saved when I was right out of college, went to church all the time, never heard the gospel, and actually went to my priest. And I said I was converted. I'd come to Jesus. No joke. He was red in the face, mad, saying, "You've always been a Christian. You were raised in the church." And I said, "No, you don't understand. I've never been a Christian. But I feel called to ministry." And he actually did have some good advice. He said, if you feel God's called you to ministry, you need to go in the business world for a number of years. And if you can't do anything else, that's a pretty good indication. Maybe he's called you to ministry. So I did pharmaceutical sales. And then I couldn't wait to get into ministry, chomping at the bit. And went to seminary, pastored a church in Pensacola. Pensacola was awesome, that experience of planning a church. We saw tons of people come to faith, but that was not my calling.
I understand.
I just didn't have tough skin, admittedly, and it was just, it was different, and that just did not go as well. So kind of licked my wounds, came back to Birmingham. My wife was raised here, got settled in, began working with Richard Simmons. Just like you said, founded the ministry 20 years ago. Another pastor and I are on staff, and we say, let's keep this a secret because it is the best gig on the planet. We love what we do, working with men.
For people who don't know what you guys do, could you just kind of, I know I gave them a 30,000-foot view, but what do you guys do?
Well, the best way I can explain that is I do men's ministry from A to Z. So I may have a man that says, I'm not sure what it means to be a Christian. I go to church, but I want to know more. So we'll do one-on-one evangelism and go through, here's what it means to know Christ and him crucified. Well, I may have another man that says, I want to get involved in a Bible study and go deeper in the faith and step up my spiritual game. So we've got Bible studies. And then I work with pastors. We think about if you're a pastor or an elder in a church, sometimes that can be lonely. And it's good to talk to somebody outside the church. And so sometimes I'll work with pastors or seminary students. So anything really from a non-believer who doesn't know Christ, a believer who wants to go deeper, or a pastor that really just needs a pastor buddy to lean on and talk to.
And so you've been with him for 9 years.
That's right.
And prior to that, you were in the business world. What were some of the lessons you take out of the business world that you brought with you into ministry?
Great question. So I think so many of us in the South feel like the best evangelism is to say to a buddy, hey, why don't you come go to church with me? You know exactly what I'm talking about. Or if you've had a crusade or some people say, hey, let's go hear this speaker. Well, that's great, but nothing can substitute an individual in the business world who's a pharmaceutical sales rep, let's say, talking to another pharmaceutical sales rep from that pulpit and saying, let me share a little bit about who I am and what my faith is. There's no substitute for
Absolutely.
that. With the relationship, somebody, if you and I are talking to somebody, sometimes they find out we're in ministry.
You're a professional. That's what they think.
Yeah. And they'll say, I don't need to cuss. And you're like, wait a minute, let's just talk. So anyway, I would say the number one rule or the number one principle I learned in ministry, you don't have to go to seminary. You don't have to be full-time pastor to have a great pulpit to preach from. And that is where God plants you. You got to grow right there. So that's probably the best thing I learned from that.
So you just released a new book, The Relay. I got to ask, how did it get formulated in your mind? You're talking to an evangelist, so people who know me know that I am fired up about this episode.
Good.
But tell me, how did it come? How was it birthed in your life? Because it's a work of love, man.
Ooh.
It is hard to get a book published and to get it done. So tell me the origin of it.
Well, first of all, you've heard it said 1,000 times. Christians say, Christianity isn't a sprint. What do they say?
It's a marathon.
That's horrible theology because the difference between a sprint and a marathon is just one's longer than the other. That's still an individual event. Your opening segment, what'd you run to? A relay, passing the baton. Christianity is not an individual event. If we're not passing the baton, really forwarding the faith, it takes one generation. Remember you said dropping the baton?
Yep.
One generation to drop the baton. And so I thought, wait a minute, we've got to change our mindset about evangelism, about what God's called me to do. He hadn't called me just to run and win, but I've got to win other people along the way for the kingdom. I've got to pass it off continually. That's the whole genesis of the book.
I'll never forget a study that Barna did. I think this was back in the early 90s that said if something doesn't happen, we're only going to reach 4% of this new generation. And by golly, I think he hit it on the head.
That's right.
Because right now you see the falling away. So tell me this, in the book, what are some of the principles you give about this relay race?
Well, one thing is I talk about the urgency. Okay, you just said single digits with Barna. If I can just give one example. In England, you remember the Beatles. When John Lennon said the Beatles were more famous than Jesus, people were absolutely outraged. That was scandalous. Well, right now, Christianity in that same country is in the single digits. So there's an urgency that we've got to be passing on the baton. So I think that's one of the main principles. But secondly, we need practical ways, and I mean really practical, to say, what's one way I can pass along the faith in the workplace? So, for instance, if you and I are talking to somebody who's a banker, what are the chances a banker is going to be able to walk through the gospel with a coworker from A to Z on a regular basis in the workplace? That's kind of hard, okay? But it's got to start somewhere. So I encourage people to memorize a verse. Let's say you're in a Bible study. You're in a Bible study. This is something I've done practically. I'll get 10 guys in a Bible study to say, okay, we're going to memorize this verse. And I want everybody in here to share this verse with two people who you don't know where they are spiritually. And if you don't do so, you got to throw $10 in the kitty next week for missions. So we have fun with it. But that's an actual tangible way to get started. Everybody you and I talk to as a Christian says, I want to evangelize. I want to share my faith. Where do I begin?
Yep.
Well, the full-blown gospel presentation, that's awesome if you get the opportunity. But usually the best way to start is to give a verse to encourage somebody and so forth. So I've got some real practical ways to say you got to start.
And I love how it's practical, and for all those who will, you've always got your naysayers, you got those who want to start an argument before they really come up with a solution. We know evangelism is not a program. Evangelism is the person of Jesus Christ.
Yeah,
we know
absolutely.
that. But in order to share Jesus, you have to have a method. And so what you're offering are just practical methods of being able to get to the message of Jesus.
That's
so
exactly right.
when you're dealing with these groups and when you're talking about the relay, it has to start at the home first. You have to live what you say you believe.
Right.
What do you find are some of the obstacles people have to get over in sharing their faith?
Sure. I would say youth groups and children's programs, meaning so many people farm out the spiritual rearing of their children to the church. The church is awesome as a supplement.
Yep.
A youth group is awesome as a supplement. Sunday school classes for little children, vacation Bible schools, awesome. But a portion of scripture I hit on a lot is Deuteronomy 6.
Yeah.
4-9. It's called the Shema,
Yep.
which is Hebrew word for "oh, hear." And it's saying, as you rise up in the morning, well, there's no VBS to start the day for a child, quicker than the parents. When you walk by the way, when you go to bed, that parents are supposed to be passing along the baton. So that's what I would say. I think the biggest danger, the biggest hurdle is parents farming out that responsibility, like you said earlier, to the professionals.
Right. And we're not against youth groups or children's programs. If I could give the analogy, it's like a fence. What you're trying to do is a fence is not only for protection, it is to mark your territory. Mm-hmm. And as a parent, to build a fence, you've got to have two things. You have to have the railing and you have to have the post. Mm-hmm. Well, the railing is what you're doing daily. Mm-hmm. I mean, that is the building in and just creating that environment. The post is the experience that they can have that almost strengthens that railing of when you go to a church with like-minded people. Mm-hmm. So it's not that we're against other programs. We're saying don't trust that to be the shepherd for your kids. Allow that to be the post that just kind of reinforces what you're doing on a daily basis. So as a parent is doing this, when you got into the relay, what was the hardest chapter to write for you?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked.
I am a professional.
I'm so glad you asked. Brother, I'm getting chill. You can't make up chill bump.
No.
I mean, seriously, I'm so glad you asked that. Okay, so, and I don't want to give it away, but there's a chapter on David. Okay, so David ran a strong race after the Lord, and he's going to the best of his ability, pass off truths to his son Solomon, like on his deathbed. But I was on the chapter, David. I'm trying not to give too much away. I'll talk about.
They're going to buy the book anyway.
Okay, that's
They're
right.
going to buy it. You're going to buy the book. I'm going to tell you where to buy it in just a few moments, but go ahead and give them something.
Okay, so I'm talking about when my son Miller was a little kid, and he was following in a very unique way in my footsteps, and just how intimidated as a dad I was to think this little fella, when he's older, he's following in my footsteps. Well, unfortunately, I didn't have footsteps from my forefathers. So I kind of had to charter a new course on my own, and it's been hard, seriously. My siblings and I, we've had to charter a whole new course. And so I'm talking about how intimidating that is back here. I go through the whole chapter, and at the very end, I'm standing at the Grove in Ole Miss. My son is 18 years old. And I'm literally seeing, here come these children, but I'm seeing my son making tracks of his own. And so, man, how did that come together? I'm down at Seaside, and my family's at the beach. I'm finishing this chapter on David. I'm beating my head against the wall. It was the hardest one. And there's a little grocery store, and I'm sitting out front. I got my computer saying, Lord, bring it together, bring it together, bring it together. And then all of a sudden, it was like the skies opened up, and hallelujah. I thought, I got it. The Grove, when I'm dropping him off and I'm watching him walk away, tears coming down my eyes. So, man, that was the hardest, but the most rewarding, bar none.
Wow. Okay. Well, see, that I think that little insight gives those who are listening and watching us an opportunity to go, I want to read that. Yeah. I want to experience those chill bumps like he just had, because you have to live it. And when you're writing on pages, it's, I'll never forget Dr. Drummond taught me many years ago. He says, when you speak for a moment. When you write for a lifetime. So these words will be used for decades to come. And so I appreciate that. The other thing I would say is I love how you've created that environment. My wife and I, we've been invited to do a conflict resolution for parents and teenagers. And we were just discussing it, and Tara went, I think the best way to avoid conflict is to set up an environment just that does not promote conflict, that it just automatically becomes the parent-child relationship where you're creating that possibility for spiritual growth in their life. So I love what you're doing. All right, so I've asked you about the toughest question. Let me ask you this. What was your favorite, outside of that experience with your son, what was your favorite part of the book? What's your favorite takeaway from the book?
My favorite takeaway, how about a story that's not in the book but fits?
Yeah.
And this would be my favorite takeaway because it's real fresh. This is super fresh. So my other son, Georgie, is 18. He just went off to Auburn. So we're empty nesters. But I had this thing where we went out to Oak Mountain. I said, George, I want to talk to you about some final send-off principles and go over some fundamentals before you go off. And we kind of had a coming of age. Well, it's late at night. I'm at Oak Mountain, parked the car. I got a tiki torch. And I said, George, it's corny, but I got something in the woods I want to show you. Well, unbeknownst to him, I've got some other people along the path. He knows nothing. And so as we're walking, I'm talking to him about what it means to be a gentleman and how to treat a lady, what it means to really not just claim Christ, but live it, like you said earlier. Well, about 200 yards in, pitch black dark, his brother steps out. And then I hand the torch to him. And then the two of them walk, and Miller shares the next kind of life lesson or principle. Then his first cousin steps out later. They take the torch, walk a segment, an uncle, another uncle, and finally the grandfather. It's that passing of the torch from one literally to the other. And we all circle back around, and our campsite was right here at the end. And we just talked about, you know, a whole new life and how he has to stake his flag for Christ, what it means to know Christ. We would say, George, don't take this for granted. We've had a rough go trying to pass this to you because most of us didn't have it. Serve it well. So that principle, I would say that was my favorite moment because I just dropped him off at college a week ago. And that's fresh on my mind. But I think that personified what the whole book is about. I really do. I think that personified the whole point I'm trying to get across.
And I think there are people that are, it's resonating in their life right now because the one thing as a parent that you really guard against is to have your children take things for granted, to feel the spirit of entitlement. And we always think about that in passing down wealth, but passing down spiritual wisdom, sometimes your children don't realize it wasn't always like this. Don't take it for granted that you have this kind of an environment growing up in. So that's a great word. And that brings me to right now, so many kids are coming from broken homes. I think the latest stat is around 23% nationally. A lot of that is absentee fathers. In fact, now, it used to be I talked about absentee fathers. Now I'm talking about absentee parents, but specifically for where you're coming to the table. If you had one chance to speak to every man, every father, every guy in America, what would be your charge to them?
My charge would be, don't live a life that would fit Cats in the Cradle. You remember that song. And I would say it really doesn't matter where you were handed the baton. If you had to pick it up on your own, if you've dropped it before, it's never too late. No substitute can be found for a godly man shepherding his kids and entrusting the faith. Remember Barna, you said earlier, the statistics prove it out, that if you are pouring into your kids, and I mean not just kind of spending time, but pouring the Word of God into them, there's no substitute. And statistically, if you want to see your children walk in a manner worthy of the gospel, the father has to be instrumental in that, and the mother too, but I think especially the father. Wouldn't you?
No, I agree. I think the stats present that if a child comes to know Christ, there's 5% chance of the family coming to know Christ. If the lady, it's like 14%, but if the husband comes to know Christ, there's like a 37% opportunity for the entire family to come to know Christ. So that to me is where you really want to, everyone's important. There's not like one's more important than the other. It just seems like we put a lot more emphasis on students, children, and women, but we're not really reaching out to the men. And one of our dear friends, Rick Burgess, who has the manchurch.com that seems to be growing, that's his passion. That is his energy. So I'm going to go down that road with you of going, what does the church have to do? You deal with men.
Sure.
You're the men's ministry.
Sure.
What does the church have to do to let men rise up and take the lead?
I would say it's got to be reiterated time and time again with Dad sitting in the pews. I'm so glad you're here, and corporate worship is so important. Thank you for being a part of the church. But you can't just lean on this as the end all and be all of the spiritual rearing of your children. And people say, we don't need to have programs. Yes, we do. We need to have programs. We need to have a program for dads to say, here are some tangible ways for you to take that Sunday morning hour and literally instill it in your kids throughout the week. And like I said earlier, make a game of something or have kids memorize a scripture. And can I give you one more?
Absolutely.
All right. Okay. This kind of ties in, but this is probably one of the best things I can say, because I tried to put some of this book into practice. Long story. Took my daughters about a week ago to this place. It's an old bridge, and you jump off the bridge down in the water below. The music this crowd was playing was the filthiest, nastiest music I honestly think I've ever heard in my life. It was a rough crowd, about 10 people. And I thought, I'm going to go over there and say something sarcastic about the music, because some kids are around, my daughters. And I thought, why would I possibly do that if their heart's not in the right place? And so we had a Barbie raft, and I thought, Lord, I'm just going to say randomly, do y'all need a Barbie raft? And, I'll leave it with you. And if they say yes, I'm just going to go down and share the gospel. So I said, hey, do y'all want a Barbie raft? We can't fit it in the car. We don't want to inflate it. And they said, yeah, come on down. So I went down, and remember, my daughters are sitting right up on that bridge. So as I'm evangelizing the people down here, I'm also mindful that I'm evangelizing my daughters.
Right.
They need the gospel. You need the gospel. I need the gospel as much as those kids down on that shore. And I basically said, do y'all believe in chance or coincidence? I don't. I said, I would so appreciate if y'all just gave me 5 minutes to share something that changed my life. So I asked permission. They said, sure. And I was nervous. Because it was
I understand.
rough crowd in the middle of nowhere. But anyway, I just went through and talked about Jesus offered me a better way, quoted some scripture. But towards the end, I said, y'all may not remember much about some random guy with a Barbie raft. I said, but if there's one thing I'd encourage you to do, just start reading through the book of John and say, God, if there's a better way for me, would you reveal it in the book of John? I said, I would just encourage y'all to do that. So anyway, the point I'm making is I'm evangelizing other people, but I'm not neglecting my daughters. And I think sometimes men are so sitting in the pews and listening, but we've got to be actively doing things, tangibly doing things to instill the faith in our kids. That make sense?
No, absolutely. It changed my life when I was reading Billy Graham's autobiography, or his biography, and he had been gone for like 6 months. And when he got there, the plane landed, and a little girl ran up to him and wanted to hug him. And he just said, whose child is this? And it was his own. He'd been gone for so long, he did not recognize his own daughter. And I remember reading that going, man, may that never be. And of course, now you've got Zoom, you've got FaceTime, you've got so many things that Dr. Graham didn't have. But I just went, I'm not going to try to win the world and lose my family. You can do both. You can, especially in today's society. So, let me ask you with this about the relay. When you're dealing with this, how does that come into play with what you do on a daily basis? For Richard.
Oh, for Richard, that's right. So whenever we have a Bible study, there's a tendency to say, guys, we need to be out sharing the gospel. That's a great generic statement. It's a true statement. But if I'm not giving people some specific homework assignments, and we call it homework, I say, I got some homework for y'all. And if you're willing to do it, here's some very specific things I'm going to ask y'all to do before we get back together next week. Because at the end of a Bible study, everybody's going to nod. We need to do that. We should do that. But it's really good to have that accountability. So I would say the good thing about a Bible study on a regular basis, with our ministry in particular, that there's that follow-up, there's that accountability. Say we talked about it, we nodded our heads, but did you actually do it? So I would say one of the most important things I want to do is not just talk, but say, hey, I'm trying to live this out, and here's some examples. What about you guys? You know, so I would say that's where it really comes to play, is the application of the faith.
All right, I'm going to ask you this. Who should buy this book?
Who should buy this book? Truly, anybody who's thinking, I really want to share my faith. I feel convicted. I'm not sharing my faith. I don't know where to begin. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to do it. I don't have a seminary degree. That's the kind of person that should buy this to get you started sharing your faith. Baby steps, but it also hits on the heavy hitting big steps.
And where can listeners get it?
That's right. So georgeshamblin.com, and also on Amazon. If they look up The Relay, George Shamblin, it's on Amazon, and also on a webpage, georgeshamblin.com.
Okay, so you have your own website, George Shamblin. So if a group wanted you to come speak, or Sunday school, men's group, any of that, you're available to go out and speak?
Absolutely. And just like today being in the studio, I'm coming out of my seat. It's great actually being somewhere talking. So I would love nothing more.
Zoom fatigue is a real deal. People don't understand that. Zoom fatigue is there, man. I am so excited about being actually in a live audience. So how do people get in touch with you?
The same with georgeshamblin.com. It's got an email. I've got my cell that's probably on the webpage somewhere. And I'd really love to hear from people. Guy called last week, said, we've got a Bible study. Can you tell me about the book? And I'm actually going to go and kick it off. So I'm excited about that.
So real quick, though, how about someone that wanted to get in touch with you guys at the center?
Thank you. The center, bham.org. Got 10 guys on staff. So if somebody wanted to learn more about the other men, what they offer, it's the center, bham.org. It tells them everything about the other men on staff, what they offer. If I'm not a fit, great. There's plenty of guys up there that can kind of meet somebody's needs where they are.
Before we go, what do you feel like the biggest obstacle for the relay?
The biggest obstacle right now, what would be the biggest obstacle? I would say I just want to be out talking about it. So the Zoom, that's just not doing it. Thank you, Lord,
you jumped on it when Will offered it to you.
Seriously.
You said, we were all in shock. We were like, we're going to have to clean up around here. It was a frat house for 6 months. Good job, Harrison. I mean, man, Harrison came in and just made it look good. But yeah, I do agree. It's time to get out there and start it. So again, if football can happen, maybe we can start getting some crowds together again. So, man, I just appreciate you. Appreciate your the work you do and the book. I appreciate your time on the podcast today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be right back. It's George Shamblin, The Relay. Get it at Amazon.com or go to georgeshamblin.com.